At his own high-end restaurant, a millionaire humiliates a waitress for her slow service. He is infuriated when he sees the locket she is wearing, and accuses her of theft, bringing her to tears. When he finds out who she is. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Now, let's get into it. Martin Cole paced his corner office, the sleek lines of his custom suit glinting under the recessed lighting. In one hand, his phone buzzed with another deal waiting to be closed. In the other, a crystal tumbler swirled with imported scotch, a habit more ritual than indulgence. His voice, clipped and commanding, cut through the air as he finalized a multi-million-dollar acquisition. The contractor on the other end stammered slightly, trying to negotiate a delay, but Martin's tone brooked no argument. "Then find someone who can meet the deadline," he barked, ending the call without waiting for a response. Tossing the phone onto the polished mahogany desk, he glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown skyscraper. The city buzzed below, a sprawling web of connections and opportunities he had long since mastered. Martin smiled faintly. Everything in life was a transaction, and he always came out ahead. His assistant knocked lightly and entered, holding out the revised blueprints for the luxury hotel he was developing. "Mr. Cole, the architect sent these over. There's a delay with the glass panels, shipping issues." Martin's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents. "Unacceptable. Tell him to expedite it, or I'll find someone who can." He didn't look up as his assistant nodded and left. The project wasn't just another hotel, it was a symbol of dominance. Every corner, every fixture, screamed opulence. He'd been personally involved in selecting details, ensuring it would cement his reputation as a visionary in the hospitality industry. The thought of anything less than perfection made his jaw tighten. That evening, Martin swapped his suit for a tuxedo and headed to the city's most exclusive gala. The event was a parade of polished smiles and handshakes, every interaction laced with subtle power plays. Martin moved through the crowd like a shark in calm waters. When it was his turn to speak, the room fell silent. Martin took the podium, his presence commanding. "Success," he began, his voice measured and confident, "isn't given, it's earned. It takes grit, vision, and relentless pursuit." He glanced at the sea of faces, most hanging on his every word. "I built my empire from nothing. And I'll tell you this, those who want something for free don't deserve to have it." The crowd erupted in polite applause as Martin stepped down, shaking hands with a local senator who complimented his speech. "Your story's inspiring," the senator said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, it's what this country's all about." Martin grinned, accepting the compliment, though deep down, he felt nothing. He'd told the story countless times, and while the details were true, they'd been polished to fit a narrative he sold to others, and to himself. Back at his penthouse later that night, the world's noise faded. The space was pristine, all clean lines and muted tones, a stark contrast to the cluttered world outside. He poured himself another drink and settled into his leather chair, staring at his computer screen. The spreadsheets for his restaurant empire reflected steady growth. The amber flame, his crowning jewel, was a consistent top performer. Martin leaned back, letting a rare moment of satisfaction wash over him. But even as he reveled in his success, there was a quiet emptiness in the air. The sprawling penthouse felt too quiet, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the city below. For a brief moment, he thought of something he hadn't in years, a small hand clutching his finger, a giggle that had once filled his heart with something he couldn't quite name. He shook the thought away and returned his focus to the numbers. Success was tangible. Emotions were not. The cafe was bustling with the quiet hum of muted conversations and the occasional clink of silverware on fine china. Martin Cole sat at a corner table, perfectly composed in his tailored suit, sipping an espresso. Across from him, his brother, Peter, leaned back casually in his chair, the relaxed posture a stark contrast to Martin's deliberate precision. Peter wore an off-the-rack blazer and a wide smile that felt a little too genuine for Martin's taste. "You know," Peter said, gesturing to the cafe around them, "this place has character. Not as shiny as one of your spots, but there's something refreshing about it." Martin's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Character doesn't pay the bills, Peter. Quality does." Peter chuckled, shaking his head. "That's you in a nutshell, isn't it? Everything has to be perfect. Polished. You'd probably start barking orders if you owned this place." "It's called running a business properly," Martin replied, his voice cool. "You should try it sometime." Peter's smile faltered but didn't vanish. "That's rich coming from someone who hasn't had a real conversation in years. Everything with you is, what's the word? Transactional." Martin bristled but kept his expression unreadable. "I didn't come here to be lectured." "No, you came here because Mom guilted you into meeting me." Peter leaned forward, his tone softening. "Look, Marty, I'm not saying you haven't done well for yourself. You have. But somewhere along the way, you forgot how to just be. Not every moment is about winning." Martin stared at his brother, his jaw tight. "I'm not interested in your philosophy on life, Peter. Some of us have to work for what we have." Peter shook his head again, a mixture of frustration and sadness crossing his face. "You're right, Martin. I can't compete with you. I just hope you figure out what's really important before it's too late." As Peter left, Martin sat in silence, his espresso untouched. The words hung in the air longer than he cared to admit, but eventually, he shrugged them off. People like Peter didn't understand success. They never would. That evening, Martin sat across from his girlfriend, Vanessa, at an exclusive restaurant where the waitlist stretched for months. She was stunning in a designer dress, her laughter light and practiced. As they shared a bottle of wine, Vanessa's excitement bubbled over. "So," she said, leaning forward, "I was thinking, maybe we could go to Santorini next month? Just the two of us. We could rent a villa, unwind for a while. Doesn't that sound amazing?" Martin swirled the wine in his glass, watching the way the light danced on its surface. "It's an interesting idea, but I was hoping you'd accompany me to the gala next month instead." Vanessa blinked, her enthusiasm dimming slightly. "The gala? You mean the one for the new hotel launch?" "Exactly. It's an important event, and having you there would make an impression. You're perfect for the role." She tilted her head, her smile now tinged with confusion. "Role?" Martin leaned back, his expression softening in what he thought was charm. "You know what I mean. You've got presence. People notice you. It's good for networking." Vanessa laughed, but the sound was forced. "I guess I should be flattered that my presence is so valuable." Martin didn't catch the edge in her tone. "It is. And afterward, we can talk about Santorini. Maybe even next quarter." Vanessa nodded, her smile returning, but something had shifted. Martin didn't notice. To him, the conversation had gone exactly as planned. Later that week, Martin attended a networking event at a private club, the kind of place where the air seemed to hum with quiet power. He was in his element, gliding from conversation to conversation, shaking hands and exchanging knowing smiles. That's when he spotted Anthony Carter, a former business partner turned competitor. The two men had a history that was equal parts mutual respect and quiet rivalry. "Martin," Anthony said, his grin sharp. "Still conquering the world, I see." "Anthony," Martin replied smoothly. "I could say the same about you. Though last I heard, that downtown project of yours hit a snag." Anthony's grin faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Nothing I can't handle. But you know how it is. Challenges keep things interesting." "Interesting isn't profitable," Martin said, his tone dripping with casual superiority. "But I'm sure you'll figure it out eventually." Anthony's eyes narrowed, but his smile never wavered. "You always were good at playing the long game, Martin. I'll give you that." "And you were always good at playing catch-up," Martin replied, raising his glass in a mock toast. The exchange was brief, but it set the tone for the rest of the evening. Martin's interactions with others were laced with the same careful balance of charm and dominance. As the night wore on, he basked in the quiet acknowledgement of his power, the respect and envy of those around him. When he finally returned to his penthouse that night, he felt the familiar rush of satisfaction. He had navigated the evening perfectly, maintained his status, and outmaneuvered an old rival. But as he poured himself a drink and stared out over the city, a strange thought crept in, unbidden. Peter's words from the cafe echoed faintly, barely more than a whisper. Martin shook his head, dismissing them as he always did. There was no room for sentimentality in a life like his. Everything he had was earned, and everything else was just noise. Martin sat alone in the back seat of his car, the city lights streaking past as his driver navigated toward the amber flame. He adjusted his cufflinks, the memory of the restaurant's acquisition playing in his mind like a film he had directed. Years ago, the amber flame had been the crown jewel of the city's culinary scene, an untouchable bastion of elegance. Martin, still climbing the ladder of success, had walked past its grand doors countless times, imagining the day it would belong to him. At the time, the owner, a stubborn old man named Charles Beaumont, had dismissed Martin's offers outright. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was Charles's legacy. Martin didn't take no for an answer. For years, he worked relentlessly, building his empire and expanding his influence. Every step forward brought him closer to his goal. When Charles finally began to falter, age and declining health forcing him to consider retirement, Martin was ready. He didn't just make an offer, he made the offer. One that not even Charles, with all his sentimentality, could refuse. The day the deal closed, Martin had stood in the restaurant's dining room, taking in the grand chandeliers, the gleaming silverware, and the hushed murmur of patrons enjoying their meals. This was no longer Charles's legacy. It was his. He'd made sure to keep the name, it carried weight, but everything else had changed under his exacting direction. Now, as Martin stepped out of the car and into the restaurant's opulent foyer, he felt the same surge of pride he had that first day. The amber flame was his kingdom, and he ruled it with absolute authority. Inside, the air was alive with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of glassware. Every detail, from the fresh floral arrangements on each table to the subtle golden glow of the lighting, had been curated to exude sophistication. Martin strode through the room, his sharp eyes scanning for imperfections. His staff snapped to attention as he passed, their movements quick and precise. At the kitchen door, he stopped a junior chef carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He inspected the plate with a critical eye. "These crostini are over-toasted," he said, his tone sharp but measured. "Fix them. Now." "Yes, Mr. Cole," the chef stammered, hurrying away. Martin continued his round, stepping into the kitchen where the energy was frenetic but controlled. He spoke to the head chef briefly, reminding him of an upcoming menu revamp, then moved on to the dining room again, pausing to greet a regular patron, a well-known senator, with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. Everything about the amber flame reflected Martin's obsession with precision and excellence. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a stage, and every guest was part of the performance. Politicians, CEOs, and celebrities flocked to its tables, drawn not just by the food but by the exclusivity it promised. Martin settled into his private corner booth, a space reserved solely for him or his most important guests. Tonight, he was meeting Stephen Monroe, an influential real estate developer who had expressed interest in a joint venture. The waiter appeared almost immediately, offering Martin his usual, a neat scotch, and disappearing as quickly as he'd come. Stephen arrived a few minutes later, all smiles and confidence. "Martin," he said, sliding into the seat opposite, "this place never ceases to impress. You've really outdone yourself." Martin gave a modest smile, though he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. "It's all about the details," he said. "People come here expecting perfection. I make sure they get it." Their conversation quickly turned to business, the two men discussing terms and potential returns with the kind of brisk efficiency Martin appreciated. As they talked, the waiter returned, setting down a plate of the restaurant's signature foie gras. "Try this," Martin said, gesturing to the dish. "It's a favorite here. Pairs well with the syrah they'll bring out next." Stephen took a bite, nodding appreciatively. "No wonder this place is the talk of the town." Martin leaned back slightly, his confidence growing with every passing moment. This was his domain, his arena. Here, he was untouchable. By the time the check arrived, discreetly delivered and just as discreetly handled by Martin, the deal was as good as done. As Stephen left, promising to have his team draw up the paperwork, Martin lingered in his booth, letting the satisfaction of the evening wash over him. The Amber Flame wasn't just a restaurant. It was proof that Martin Cole could take anything he wanted and make it his own. His gaze swept the room once more, landing on a young waitress as she carefully balanced a tray of desserts. She was new, he remembered approving her hire, but something about her seemed out of place. Her movements were just a little too hesitant, her posture too unsure. Martin frowned. He made a mental note to address it with the manager. There was no room for anything less than perfection here. As the waitress disappeared into the kitchen, Martin turned his attention back to the table. Everything about the evening had gone exactly as planned. Just as it always did. The Amber Flame hummed with its usual elegant energy, the murmur of well-heeled diners mixing with the soft clink of glasses and the low notes of a piano in the corner. At his private booth near the window, Martin Cole sat with Vanessa, his flawlessly dressed girlfriend, and two of his top business associates, Richard and Claudia. The table was a showcase of indulgence, fine wine, perfectly plated appetizers, and laughter loud enough to turn a few discreet heads in the room. Martin, in his element, swirled his wine as he recounted the story of his first major deal, his voice commanding the conversation. "So there I was, 27 years old, sitting across from a board of executives twice my age. They thought I was just some kid who didn't know what he was doing." Vanessa leaned in, her smile radiant and encouraging. "And let me guess, you showed them otherwise?" Martin smirked, glancing around the table to ensure he had everyone's attention. "Let's just say that by the time I walked out of that room, they were begging me to take their money." Richard laughed heartily, clapping Martin on the shoulder. "Classic Martin. You've always had a way of turning the tables." Claudia raised her glass, her earrings glinting in the light. "To turning tables, and building empires." The group toasted, the sharp clink of crystal filling the space. Martin basked in the camaraderie, the sense of control he felt in orchestrating not just the business world but even the mood at his own table. He waved over a passing waiter, barely glancing at the menu as he ordered another bottle of wine and an array of dishes to share. At the far end of the room, Ashley clutched her notepad tightly, her fingers trembling just slightly. It had been a busy night, and the weight of constant glances from the head waiter was pressing on her. She knew this job was a step up from the small diner she'd worked at before, but the pressure to meet the restaurant's impossible standards was something she was still getting used to. When the order came through from Martin's table, she felt her stomach drop. Everyone on staff knew who he was. Martin Cole wasn't just the owner of the Amber Flame, he was its unofficial king. Every plate, every detail, had to be perfect when it came to him. She adjusted her apron and took a deep breath, determined not to mess this up. Back at the table, Martin was leaning back in his chair, his arm casually draped around Vanessa as she leaned toward him, whispering something that made him chuckle. The plates arrived, and Ashley carefully began setting them down, her movements slow and deliberate. But as she placed the final dish in front of Claudia, the stem of a half-full water glass on her tray wobbled. Time seemed to slow as the glass tipped, spilling a cascade of cold water across the pristine white tablecloth. Claudia gasped, jerking back in her seat, while Vanessa let out a small shriek of surprise. The room around them went eerily quiet, the soft hum of conversation dimming as nearby diners turned their heads. Martin's sharp intake of breath was the loudest sound in the silence. He stared at the spreading water stain as if it were a personal affront, then slowly lifted his eyes to Ashley, who stood frozen, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Are you serious?" Martin's voice was low but cutting, each word carrying a weight that made Ashley's stomach drop. "This is the level of competence we're dealing with?" I am so sorry," Ashley stammered, reaching for a napkin to mop up the spill. Her hands trembled as she worked, her vision blurring slightly with tears she refused to let fall. Martin didn't let up, leaning back in his chair and gesturing toward her as if to make her the punchline of a joke. "Tell me, do they not train you, or is this just natural talent?" Richard laughed, his deep voice echoing through the suddenly too quiet room. Claudia managed a polite chuckle, while Vanessa gave an almost apologetic look before smirking in solidarity with Martin. Ashley felt the heat of humiliation creep up her neck, but she kept her head down, focusing on the tablecloth. Her ears buzzed with the sound of Martin's guests laughing, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her chest. As the head waiter rushed over to assist, Martin waved him off, still focused on Ashley. "I've seen clowns with better coordination," he quipped, earning another round of laughter from his table. The corners of his mouth curled into a self-satisfied smile, and he raised his glass, taking a long sip of wine as if to punctuate his superiority. Ashley muttered another apology and retreated to the kitchen as quickly as she could, her face burning with shame. She could feel the eyes of other diners on her back, their curiosity and pity adding to the crushing weight of the moment. Once she was behind the kitchen doors, she exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Back at the table, Martin's guests had moved on, their conversation returning to light-hearted banter about the upcoming gala and mutual acquaintances. Vanessa leaned in again, her voice low but playful. "You really didn't have to go that hard on her." Martin shrugged, his smile faint but unapologetic. "If she can't handle a little pressure, she's in the wrong business." The group laughed again, and Martin felt a familiar satisfaction settle over him. The evening, minor hiccup aside, was exactly as he'd intended, loud, indulgent, and entirely on his terms. As far as he was concerned, the spilled water was just another moment to showcase his control. Little did he know, the night's events had already set something far greater in motion, something he couldn't control even if he tried. The evening had settled back into its rhythmic hum. Martin, flushed with the wine and the glow of admiration from his guests, leaned back in his chair, recounting yet another story about a deal only he could have pulled off. His words flowed effortlessly, the kind of confidence born from knowing you controlled the room. Ashley approached the table carefully, her tray balanced with precision. She had double-checked every plate this time, ensuring there wouldn't be a repeat of her earlier misstep. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down a dish in front of Vanessa, then moved to collect the empty plates from Martin's side. She avoided his gaze, her focus solely on her task. As she reached across the table to retrieve a wine glass, her uniform shifted slightly, and the chain around her neck slipped free, dangling just over the table. At the end of the chain was a delicate gold locket, its intricate design catching the warm glow of the overhead lights. Martin's words faltered mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into silence. His sharp eyes locked onto the locket, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of laughter and conversation around the table faded into the background, the world narrowing to that small, familiar piece of jewelry. His chest tightened, a wave of emotions surging through him so quickly he couldn't name them all: shock, confusion, anger, disbelief. "Where did you get that?" he demanded suddenly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a whip. The force of his words startled Ashley, her hand freezing mid-motion as she turned to face him. I'm sorry," she stammered, blinking at him in confusion. "That locket," Martin said, his tone sharper now, his eyes boring into hers. He pointed at the pendant hanging from her neck. "Where did you get it?" Ashley instinctively clutched the locket, her fingers curling protectively around it. It's mine. I've had it for years." Martin's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me. That locket is one of a kind. Where did you get it?" The tension at the table was palpable. Vanessa looked between Martin and Ashley with wide eyes, while Richard and Claudia exchanged uncertain glances. Other diners nearby began to take notice, their quiet conversations faltering as they turned to see what was happening. "I'm not lying," Ashley said, her voice trembling. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "It was a gift." "From who?" Martin snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Do you even know what that locket means?" Ashley's face flushed, and her grip on the locket tightened. I don't have to explain anything to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sudden movement made Ashley flinch, and the tray in her hands wobbled precariously. Vanessa reached out as if to calm Martin, but he shrugged her off, his entire focus still on Ashley. "Who gave it to you?" he demanded again, his voice now loud enough to turn every head in the room. "Tell me the truth." Ashley took another step back, her breathing uneven. She glanced around, her cheeks burning under the weight of so many eyes on her. I have to go," she said, her voice breaking. Clutching the locket tightly, she turned and fled toward the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. For a moment, the table was silent. Martin stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his face pale. Vanessa reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling slightly. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice careful. Martin didn't respond. He sank back into his chair, his gaze fixed on the table, his mind racing. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly, while Claudia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The weight of the moment hung over them like a storm cloud. "Martin," Vanessa said gently, leaning toward him. "Are you okay?" His hands shook slightly as he picked up his glass and took a long sip, but the wine didn't soothe him. The image of the locket burned in his mind, dragging him back to a time he had worked hard to bury. He could still see it clearly, the delicate gold pendant, etched with a floral design, hanging around the neck of a little girl who had once been his world. That locket had been a gift, one he had chosen with care. He had given it to his daughter on her 3rd birthday, fastening it around her small neck with a promise to always protect her. But that promise had been broken, shattered by choices and circumstances he still struggled to reconcile. He hadn't seen his daughter in over 2 decades. And yet here it was, that same locket, around the neck of a waitress in his restaurant. His mind churned with possibilities, none of them making sense. Could it be a coincidence? Had someone stolen it? And if so, how had it ended up here, of all places? Vanessa touched his arm lightly, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Martin, seriously. What's going on?" He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice low and strained. I need a moment." Without waiting for a response, he stood and walked toward his office, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, but he couldn't let this go. Not yet. Not when the past he had tried so hard to forget was suddenly staring him in the face. The memory of her mother's laughter was Ashley's favorite. Even now, she could hear it if she closed her eyes, a bright, musical sound that made everything seem possible, no matter how difficult things were. Their small apartment in Paris had been nothing fancy, but Mary had filled it with warmth. The chipped kitchen table was where they shared everything, from meals to dreams. Mary's face, framed by soft waves of chestnut hair, always seemed to glow as she told Ashley bedtime stories, her voice weaving magic even after long days of working multiple jobs. Ashley remembered one night in particular, her 8th birthday. They couldn't afford much, but Mary had found a way to make it special. She baked a small cake using borrowed ingredients from a kind neighbor and decorated it with a single candle. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Mary had said, her tired eyes sparkling as she watched Ashley blow it out. "What did you wish for?" Mary asked, leaning close. "I can't tell, or it won't come true," Ashley said with a giggle, her small arms wrapping around her mother in a hug. Even then, she understood that her mother's love was the best gift she could ever have. Life wasn't easy, but Mary's resilience made it bearable. She worked as a seamstress by day and cleaned offices at night, her hands often raw and red from the effort. Ashley would sit quietly in the evenings, watching her mother sew intricate patterns onto dresses for women who lived lives Mary could only imagine. Ashley's favorite part was when Mary would hum as she worked, the soft melody a soothing backdrop to the whir of the sewing machine. Whenever Ashley felt discouraged, Mary found a way to lift her spirits. During one particularly tough winter, when their apartment was drafty and the heating barely worked, Mary transformed their struggles into an adventure. She built a fort out of blankets in the living room and told Ashley it was a castle. They huddled inside, drinking hot tea from mismatched cups, and Mary spun stories about brave queens and daring explorers. "Never forget," Mary would say, her hands warm around Ashley's, "you're stronger than anything life throws at you." As Ashley grew older, she began to notice the toll life was taking on her mother. The dark circles under Mary's eyes became permanent, and her laughter, though still beautiful, grew less frequent. But Mary never complained. She celebrated small victories, like finding a sale on bread or getting a good deal at the market, treating them as though they were grand triumphs. Their life abroad was a patchwork of experiences, stitched together by Mary's determination. They moved often, chasing better opportunities, but no matter where they went, Mary always found a way to make their new place feel like home. Ashley learned to adapt quickly, her mother's optimism rubbing off on her even in the hardest times. The heartbreak came swiftly and without warning. Ashley was 17 when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, whispered prayers, and endless tears. Mary faced it all with the same quiet courage she had shown her whole life, reassuring Ashley even as her strength faded. One evening, as they sat together in the hospital room, Mary pressed a kiss to Ashley's forehead. "You'll be okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You're my greatest accomplishment, and I know you'll do amazing things." Ashley clung to those words as Mary's condition worsened. When the end came, it left Ashley feeling hollow, as though the light in her life had been extinguished. But even in her grief, she held on to her mother's lessons. She knew she had to keep going, to honor Mary's sacrifices and the love that had carried them through so much. After Mary's passing, Ashley moved back to her grandparents' hometown, the only family she had left. They welcomed her with open arms, their small house offering a semblance of stability as she tried to rebuild her life. Her grandparents were kind but lived modestly, their means limited by years of hard work and little reward. Determined to support herself and pursue her dream of going to college, Ashley began searching for a job. When she saw the posting for a server position at the Amber Flame, she hesitated. The restaurant's reputation for excellence intimidated her, but she knew it was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She borrowed her grandmother's blazer for the interview and did her best to appear confident, even though her nerves were nearly overwhelming. To her surprise, she got the job. Working at the Amber Flame was a far cry from the small diners and cafes she was used to, but Ashley threw herself into it, determined to prove she could keep up. The work was grueling, the standards impossibly high, but she reminded herself of her mother's words, "You're stronger than anything life throws at you." Each shift was a test of endurance, but Ashley found small moments of pride in her progress. She learned the menu inside and out, memorized the quirks of regular patrons, and worked tirelessly to perfect her timing and composure. She often stayed late, cleaning tables and double-checking her work, knowing that her effort would bring her closer to her goals. Even so, there were days when the pressure felt crushing, when she doubted whether she belonged in such an elite establishment. But she pushed through, fueled by memories of her mother's determination and the belief that Mary was watching over her. The locket around Ashley's neck was her most treasured possession. It was the only thing she had from her father, a man her mother rarely spoke of. All Ashley knew was that he'd given her the locket when she was very young, just before he and her mother had separated. Mary had told her that it was a reminder of how much she was loved, even if life had taken them in different directions. Ashley often held the locket during quiet moments, feeling its weight and drawing strength from it. It reminded her of both her parents, the father she barely remembered and the mother who had been her entire world. It was a symbol of resilience, a connection to a past she didn't fully understand but carried with her every day. As she walked into the kitchen after her encounter with Martin Cole, her hands trembling and her heart racing, she clutched the locket tightly. She didn't know why he had reacted so strongly to it, but the intensity in his eyes had unsettled her. All she wanted was to finish her shift and go home, away from the scrutiny and the questions she couldn't answer. For Ashley, every day at the Amber Flame was another step toward a brighter future, a future she hoped would honor her mother's legacy. What she didn't know was that her past, and the locket she held so dear, was about to change everything. Martin slammed the door to his office, the sound echoing in the empty space. His chest heaved as he paced back and forth, his thoughts a chaotic storm. That locket. That unmistakable, one-of-a-kind locket. How had it ended up around the neck of that waitress? He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. There was no logical explanation, only a gnawing certainty that it shouldn't have been there. He dropped into the leather chair behind his desk, running a hand over his face. His reflection in the glass windows of the office stared back at him, pale and unsettled. His thoughts spiraled, dragging him back to memories he had tried to bury. The image of Mary was the first to surface, her laugh soft and sweet, her brown eyes full of warmth. When they had first met, Mary had been the embodiment of everything he wasn't: gentle, carefree, and unshakably kind. He had fallen for her almost immediately, captivated by her warmth and the way she made even the smallest moments feel special. Their early days together had been a whirlwind of love and hope. He had felt invincible with Mary by his side, believing that her presence could soften the harder edges of his personality. They were married in a small ceremony, far from the grandeur Martin now surrounded himself with, and for a while, they had been happy. But something had shifted as time went on. Martin's ambition, the drive that had built his empire, began to bleed into their personal life. He became controlling, jealous of her independence and the easy way she connected with others. He'd rationalized his behavior as love, convincing himself that he was protecting her. Mary, for her part, had tried to make it work, her patience stretching far longer than he deserved. He remembered the arguments, the cold silences that stretched between them, the accusations that poured out of him when he felt ignored or insecure. The harder he clung to her, the more she slipped away. By the time Mary asked for a divorce, her voice calm but firm, the chasm between them was too wide to bridge. "You can't just leave," he had said, his voice rising with disbelief. "We built a life together. You don't get to walk away." "I can't live like this anymore, Martin," she'd replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't see it, but you're suffocating me. This isn't love. Not anymore." Her words had cut deep, wounding his pride more than his heart. Martin had vowed to make her pay for leaving. If she thought she could walk away unscathed, she was wrong. The divorce proceedings were bitter and drawn out, Martin using every tool at his disposal to punish her. When the settlement was finalized, Mary had walked away with almost nothing. But what he hadn't anticipated was her next move. Mary had taken Ashley, their 3-year-old daughter, and disappeared. She had left the country, fleeing to places he couldn't reach her. The custody battle had been vicious, but in the end, Mary had won. Martin had tried to track them down for years, hiring private investigators and chasing leads, but it was as if they had vanished into thin air. The last memory he had of Ashley was her 3rd birthday. He had given her the locket that day, a delicate gold pendant he had designed himself. He remembered kneeling in front of her, clasping it around her tiny neck, and telling her it was a symbol of how much he loved her. She had smiled, her eyes bright, and thrown her arms around his neck in a hug. That moment had stayed with him, frozen in time, even as everything else fell apart. Now, decades later, that same locket had reappeared in the most improbable of places. Martin clenched his fists, his mind racing. Ashley was gone. She had been gone for years. The only explanation was that the locket had been stolen, sold, or somehow ended up in the hands of this waitress. It was a betrayal of everything it had represented, a reminder of the daughter he had lost and the family he had destroyed. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His anger boiled over, a toxic mix of frustration, guilt, and grief. He couldn't let this go unanswered. He had to confront her, to demand an explanation. His chest tightened as he thought of Ashley, her small voice echoing in his mind. "Daddy, I love it. It's so pretty." The weight of his regret bore down on him, but he pushed it aside. Regret wasn't productive. Answers were. He strode to the window, staring out at the city lights below. Somewhere in the chaos of his emotions, a faint hope flickered, a desperate, irrational thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than he understood. But hope was dangerous. It led to weakness, and Martin couldn't afford that now. He turned away from the window, his jaw set. The kitchen was alive with its usual chaos, pots clanging, voices shouting orders, and the sharp hiss of steam. But all of it seemed to fade as the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that silenced the room. Martin Cole strode in, his presence slicing through the air like a blade. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides as his sharp eyes scanned the room. "I need to speak with the waitress," he barked, his voice low but laced with authority. "Ashley. Where is she?" The kitchen staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. Ashley stood frozen near the dish station, her face pale and her fingers still gripping the locket around her neck. She didn't want to turn around, but she could feel his gaze boring into her. "Ashley," Martin repeated, this time louder. The air crackled with tension, and finally, she turned to face him, her eyes wide and filled with trepidation. "What's going on?" the head chef asked, stepping between them. "Is there a problem, Mr. Cole?" "This is between her and me," Martin said sharply, his glare silencing any further protests. He pointed at Ashley. "You. Come here." Ashley hesitated, her legs trembling as she forced herself to move forward. Her steps felt like they took an eternity, each one heavier than the last. When she stopped in front of him, her gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet his piercing stare. "Where did you get that locket?" Martin demanded, his voice low but simmering with anger. He pointed to the pendant still clutched in her hand. "Tell me the truth." Ashley blinked rapidly, the tension in her chest making it hard to breathe. I didn't steal it," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's mine." "Yours?" Martin repeated, his tone incredulous. He took a step closer, looming over her. "Don't lie to me. That locket is unique. I designed it. It belonged to someone very important to me. So I'll ask again, where did you get it?" Tears welled in Ashley's eyes, her emotions threatening to spill over. The pressure of the confrontation, combined with the weight of her day, was too much to bear. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice breaking. "It was a gift, from my father." Martin froze, his breath catching in his throat. Her words echoed in his mind, jarring loose memories he had spent years trying to suppress. He stared at her, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion. "Your father?" he asked, his voice softer but still tense. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Ashley said, her tears finally spilling over. She wiped at her face with trembling hands, her voice raw with emotion. "I never met him. My mom, she never talked about him. All I know is that he gave me this locket when I was little." Martin felt the air leave his lungs as he stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with excruciating clarity. Her face, her voice, even the way she held herself, it was all so familiar. He saw traces of Mary in her, but more than that, he saw himself. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train, leaving him momentarily unable to speak. Ashley continued, her voice shaking as she recounted her story. "My mom raised me on her own. We moved a lot, different countries, different cities. She worked so hard to give me a good life, even when things were tough. She passed away last year, and I came here to live near my grandparents." Her words hung in the air, each one a weight pressing on Martin's chest. The guilt he had buried for years clawed its way to the surface, overwhelming him. He thought of Mary, her quiet strength and resilience, and how he had stripped her of everything in his blind pursuit of control. He thought of Ashley, the little girl he had once loved more than anything, and the years he had missed because of his own stubborn pride. Martin's demeanor softened as he looked at Ashley, truly looked at her. The tears streaming down her face, the tremble in her voice. It was all too much. He felt his knees weaken, the anger that had propelled him into the kitchen dissolving into something far more painful. "Ashley," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her name felt foreign and familiar all at once, like something precious he had lost and just found again. "Ashley, look at me." She hesitated, but slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet his. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the moment too heavy for words. Martin saw it then, the undeniable truth staring back at him. She was his daughter. The realization was both a gift and a curse, flooding him with regret and a desperate need to make amends. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "What have I done?" Martin's voice was soft, almost tentative, as he spoke. "What's your full name?" His hands trembled at his sides, and his chest tightened with the weight of everything he feared he was about to confirm. Ashley hesitated, her tears still falling in slow, silent streaks down her cheeks. "Ashley," she said, her voice fragile but steady. "Ashley Miller." Martin's breath caught, the air in the room seeming to vanish. Miller. Mary's maiden name. He felt the floor tilt beneath him as his worst fear and deepest hope collided in a single, shattering moment. He reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling with shaking hands. From the worn leather of his wallet, he pulled out a photograph. It was faded and creased from years of being carried around, but the image was still clear. A little girl, no older than 3, stared back at him with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. Around her small neck hung the very same locket. "Look," he said, his voice breaking as he held the photo out to her. Is this you?" Ashley's eyes widened, her trembling fingers reaching for the picture. Her breath hitched as she looked at it, her tears falling faster now. The girl in the photo was undeniably her. She had seen pictures of herself as a child, but never this one. She turned the image over in her hand, struggling to form words. "That's me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's me, but I've never seen this picture before." Martin nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His vision blurred with tears he refused to blink away, his emotions overwhelming him. He took a step closer, his voice hoarse as he said, "I gave you that locket. On your 3rd birthday." Ashley's knees nearly buckled as the words sank in. She clutched the photograph to her chest, her mind racing. "You're my father?" she asked, the words trembling on her lips. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and raw emotion. "Yes," Martin said, his voice breaking. "Ashley, I'm your father." The room seemed to spin around her. The man who had stormed into the kitchen, full of anger and accusations, was now standing before her with tears in his eyes, claiming to be the father she had never known. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, and she struggled to breathe through the flood of emotions crashing over her. "I didn't know," she said, shaking her head as if trying to make sense of it all. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know anything about you. Mom she never told me much." Martin's heart ached at her words. He stepped closer, his voice pleading. "I didn't know where you were. I searched for you, Ashley. For years. But your mother," he paused, his voice heavy with regret. "I made mistakes. I let my anger drive her away. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was lose you." Ashley's shoulders shook as she began to sob, the photograph slipping from her hands onto the floor. Martin didn't hesitate. He closed the space between them and wrapped her in his arms, pulling her into a hug that felt decades overdue. She resisted for only a moment before melting into his embrace, her hands clutching his jacket as they both cried. "I'm so sorry," Martin said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything. For not being there, for not finding you sooner. I failed you." Ashley's voice was muffled against his chest, but it carried a lifetime of pain and longing. "I didn't think I'd ever have a father. I thought you didn't want me." Martin's heart broke at her words, and he tightened his hold on her. "I wanted you more than anything. Losing you, it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And I promise, I'll never let you go again." They stood there in the middle of the kitchen, holding on to each other as years of hurt and separation melted away. The staff watched from a respectful distance, their expressions soft with quiet understanding. Even the head chef, usually gruff and unbothered, wiped at his eyes with the corner of his apron. When they finally pulled apart, Martin looked at her with a newfound determination. "I want to help you, Ashley. With anything you need. Your dreams, your future. Whatever it is, I'll make it happen." Ashley hesitated, the weight of his offer settling over her. For so long, she had carried the burden of making it on her own. Accepting help felt foreign, but the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. I just want to go to college," she said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted. To make Mom proud." Martin smiled through his tears, a warmth spreading in his chest. "We'll make it happen. Together." Later that evening, the two of them sat at one of the restaurant's private dining tables, joined by Ashley's grandparents, who had rushed over as soon as they heard the news. The table was set with simple, comforting dishes, not the usual extravagant fare of the Amber Flame. The atmosphere was warm and intimate, filled with laughter and stories. Ashley listened as her grandparents shared memories of her mother, their voices full of affection and pride. Martin chimed in with his own stories, carefully treading the line between nostalgia and regret. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, of family, that he had thought was lost to him forever. As the evening wore on, Ashley looked around the table, her heart full. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were years of distance to bridge and wounds to heal. But for the first time, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of a new beginning. Martin reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "For giving me a second chance." Ashley squeezed his hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for finding me." The night ended with hugs and promises, the kind that felt unshakable. Martin walked Ashley to the door, watching as she disappeared into the night with her grandparents. As he stood in the quiet of the restaurant, he felt a strange but welcome sensation, a sense of peace, fragile but real. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He had found his daughter, and with her, a chance to rebuild everything he had lost. Together, they would create something new, something worth holding on to.